These are good people. You can see it in the way they move through the world. They hold doors open for strangers. They check on neighbors when the lights stay off too long. They send money home to family. They work hard. They pray. They laugh. They try. In the ordinary, quiet ways people try to be decent. They would never hurt anyone. At least, that is what they believe. But history tells a stranger story. Because in the summer of 1961, inside the walls of one of the most respected universities in America, a group of ordinary, psychologically healthy, morally upright men walked into a laboratory. Teachers, salesmen, engineers, postal workers, fathers. And what many of them did inside that room would permanently change the way we understand human nature. Not because they were evil, not because they were forced, not because they were secretly monsters waiting for permission, but because of a pattern so deeply woven into human behavior that most people never notice it happening. A pattern that lives in offices, schools, families, governments, relationships, and everyday life. A pattern that can turn good people into participants in harm while they still believe they are doing the right thing. And the most disturbing part is this: that pattern lives in all of us, including you, including me. By the time this story ends, you may never look at yourself the same way again. Before we go further, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories that uncover the hidden patterns beneath human behavior, subscribe now to the Pattern Weavers, because every story has a thread. And this one leads somewhere unforgettable. To understand what happened in that laboratory, we have to go back. Further back than Yale. Further back than psychology. Back to a courtroom in Germany after the Second World War. The war had ended, but its shadow had not. The world stood in shock as the full scale of the Holocaust became impossible to deny. Entire families erased. Entire communities destroyed. Millions of Jewish men, women, and children systematically murdered. And in the city of Nuremberg, the men responsible sat in court. People expected monsters. They found men in suits. Some wore glasses. Some looked tired. Some looked like accountants, teachers, grandfathers. Ordinary faces. That was what disturbed people most. These were not wild-eyed villains from nightmares. They looked like neighbors. And yet they had overseen one of the greatest horrors in human history. The question hanging over that courtroom was not whether they were guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The real question was, how? How does a normal human being become capable of participating in something like that? How does a father kiss his children goodnight and then spend his workday helping organize mass death? How does a person cross that line? And again, the defendants offered the same answer. We were following orders. The world hated that answer. It sounded like cowardice, like excuse, like moral escape. But one young psychology student heard something else. Not a defense, a question. His name was Stanley. He grew up in New York, the son of Jewish immigrants. The Holocaust was not distant history to him. It was personal. It lived in newspaper headlines, in family conversations, in silence around dinner tables. He could not stop thinking about it. Were the Nazis simply different people? Was there something uniquely wrong with them? Or was the truth far more frightening? What if ordinary people, placed inside the right structure, could do the same? That question followed him for years. Through school, through university, through graduate study, until finally, in 1961, he decided to test it. Not with soldiers, not with criminals, with regular people. He placed a simple newspaper ad. Male volunteers needed for a study on memory and learning. Payment, $4.50. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious. 40 men responded. They came from all walks of life. A factory worker, a high school teacher, a salesman, a postal clerk, an engineer. Different ages, different backgrounds, different incomes. Before the experiment began, they were screened by professionals. Psychologically normal. No violent tendencies. No obvious signs of cruelty. Good people. Ordinary people. People like the ones sitting beside you on a bus. People like the ones you trust. People like you. When they arrived at Yale, they were introduced to another participant, a friendly middle-aged man with a calm smile and a gentle voice. We will call him James. James seemed instantly trustworthy, like someone's uncle, someone who remembered your birthday. They were told the experiment studied the relationship between punishment and memory. One person would be the teacher, the other would be the learner. They would draw lots. But the draw was fake. It was always fake. James was not a volunteer. He was an actor working with the researcher. The real participant would always become the teacher. Always. The volunteer watched as James was taken into another room and strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his arms. James casually mentioned he had a slight heart condition. The researcher nodded calmly. It will be fine. Then the volunteer was led to the main machine. A shock generator. Rows of switches stretched across the panel. 15 volts. Higher and higher. All the way to 450 volts. The final switches were not labeled with numbers. Only 3 letters. XXX. The instructions were simple. James, in the next room, would answer memory questions. Every time he got one wrong, the teacher must deliver an electric shock. Each wrong answer meant a stronger shock. The volunteer even received a sample shock themselves, a small painful jolt, to prove the machine was real. The study began. At first, the shocks were mild. 15 volts. A grunt. 30 volts. Another mistake. Then 75 volts. James sounded uncomfortable now. At 120 volts, he said clearly, "Hey, this really hurts." At 150 volts, his voice changed. "I want out of this experiment. I have a heart condition." The volunteer turned nervously to the researcher. "Shouldn't we stop?" The researcher, wearing a gray lab coat, answered calmly, "Please continue." No anger, no threat, just authority. And many participants obeyed. 165 volts. At 270 volts, James screamed, not acting like discomfort anymore. Real panic, real fear. The volunteers shifted in their seats. Some laughed nervously. Some protested. Some asked if the man was okay. The researcher replied with the same calm voice. "The experiment requires that you continue." At 300 volts, James pounded on the wall and shouted, "I refuse to answer anymore. Let me out." Then more shocks. A final scream. And then silence. Silence. No more answers. No more voice. Nothing. The teacher would often stop and say, "He is not responding. Something might be wrong." The researcher answered, "An absence of response should be treated as a wrong answer. Please continue." And many did. Sweating. Shaking. Some openly trembling. Some nearly in tears. But still pressing the switches. All the way to 450 volts. All the way to XXX. Before the study began, Stanley asked psychiatrists to predict the results. How many ordinary people would go all the way? Most experts guessed 1%. Maybe 2. Only the truly sadistic. Only deeply disturbed individuals. The actual result was 65%. 65%. Nearly 2 out of every 3 ordinary people delivered what they believed were potentially deadly electric shocks to another human being because an authority figure calmly told them to continue. And here is the part people often misunderstand. They were not comfortable. They were not cold. They were not smiling villains. They were distressed. They knew it felt wrong. They protested. They hesitated. They sweated. They begged to stop. But they continued. Because something stronger than comfort was operating. A pattern. And Stanley needed to know how deep it went. So he ran the experiment again. And again. More than 20 variations. Hundreds of participants. Each time changing one detail. In one version, he moved the experiment out of Yale and into an ordinary office building. No prestigious university. No ivy-covered authority. Just a plain office. Obedience dropped, but only to 47%. Still nearly half. In another version, the teacher could see the learner face to face. Not just hear him. Look directly into his eyes. The rate dropped further, but many still obeyed. In another version, the teacher had to physically place the learner's hand onto the shock plate. direct contact, physical closeness. Obedience dropped again. Still, some continued. Then came the most important variation. 2 additional teachers were added to the room. Both were actors. At a certain point, those 2 calmly refused. No dramatic speech. No rebellion. Just simple refusal. I am not comfortable continuing. I am stopping. That was all. And suddenly, obedience collapsed. From 65% to just 10%. Not because authority changed. Because peer behavior changed. Because someone made refusal visible. That detail is one of the most powerful findings in psychology, and almost nobody talks about it. Because the story is usually told as proof of darkness. But hidden inside it is proof of resistance. 1 person stopping changes the room. 2 people stopping can break the spell entirely. To explain why, Stanley developed a concept called the agentic state. It sounds technical, but once you understand it, you will start seeing it everywhere. The agentic state is what happens when a person stops thinking of themselves as an independent moral decision maker and begins to see themselves as an instrument of authority. Responsibility shifts. The question changes. It stops being, "Is this right?" and becomes, "Is this what I am supposed to do?" In that state, the teacher was no longer hurting someone. They were following procedure, being cooperative, doing their role. Responsibility, in their mind, belonged to the researcher, to Yale, to the system, not to them. This is not rare. This is not weakness. It is part of how humans survive. For most of history, living in groups meant safety. Following leaders meant protection. Defying the tribe could mean death. Obedience helped humans survive. The problem begins when that ancient survival mechanism enters modern systems. Corporations, governments, military chains, institutions so large that no one person feels fully responsible. That is where the agentic state becomes dangerous. And this idea connects to another woman whose work changed history. Her name was Hannah Arendt. In 1961, the same year Stanley ran his experiment, she attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the key organizers of Nazi deportations. People expected a monster. Arendt found a bureaucrat, not a genius, not a raging fanatic, a manager, a man who processed logistics, scheduled trains, moved paperwork. He did not look like evil. He looked like administration. That disturbed her more than anything. She called it the banality of evil, not because evil itself was ordinary, but because the people carrying it out often were. People who had stopped asking if something was right and focused only on whether it was required. People inside the agentic state. And then, 10 years later, another psychologist asked a deeper question. What if you did not even need an authority figure giving direct orders? What if a role alone was enough? What if simply becoming the guard, or the prisoner, could change behavior by itself? To answer that, he built a prison. It was 1971. A university basement was transformed into a mock prison. Bars, cells, a solitary confinement room. 24 healthy college students were selected after careful psychological screening. Stable, normal, good young men. Half were assigned to be guards. Half became prisoners. The guards received uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, batons, authority. The prisoners received loose smocks, chains around their ankles, numbers instead of names. Even the beginning was designed for immersion. The prisoners were arrested at home by real police officers, handcuffed, read their rights, taken away while neighbors watched, not told to arrive politely, arrested. The guards were given only one instruction: maintain order. No physical violence. That was it. No cruelty required. No script. At first, everyone treated it like a strange game. There was laughter, awkwardness. Everyone knew it was an experiment. Then day 2 arrived. The prisoners staged a rebellion. Nothing extreme. They blocked their cell doors with beds. They shouted. They resisted. And something changed in the guards. They looked at each other. And the role became real. They used fire extinguishers to force prisoners back. They removed beds. They imposed punishments. push-ups, isolation, humiliation, sleep deprivation. They made prisoners clean toilets, repeat their assigned numbers, stand for hours. No researcher ordered this. The role itself generated it. Guard required control. Control demanded punishment. The structure created behavior. By day 3, one prisoner had a severe emotional breakdown, crying, shaking, disoriented. He had to be removed. Then another. Then another. By day 4, multiple participants were emotionally collapsing. The prison had become psychologically real. And there was another deeply unsettling layer. The lead researcher himself had taken on a role. Prison superintendent. At first, he believed he was observing. But slowly, he stopped seeing students. He saw prisoners. His prisoners. When assistants raised concerns, he dismissed them. When parents worried, he reassured them. The experiment mattered more than the people. He had entered the system too. Then, on day 5, a young graduate student visited. She walked into the basement and saw young men with bags over their heads, chained together, being marched down a hallway. She was horrified. She turned to the researcher and asked, "What are you doing to these people?" He became defensive. He argued. He insisted the study was valuable. She left in tears. That night, she confronted him again. She said she could not be close to someone who allowed this. And something broke. The roll cracked. The illusion shattered. He suddenly saw what had happened. He was not outside the experiment. He was inside it. He ended the study on day 6. A planned 2-week experiment destroyed in less than a week because the system had become too real. This is the point where most people quietly think, "I would have been different. I would not have pressed the switch. I would have walked out. I would have refused." And maybe you would have. But the evidence suggests most people believe that, and most are wrong. Because the agentic state does not target bad people. It targets normal people. It works best on decent people trying to do their job well. People who want to cooperate. People who trust systems. People who assume authority is legitimate. That is why it matters. Because this is not about laboratories. It is about life. It is about workplaces where harmful decisions happen through paperwork. Families where everyone knows something is wrong, but nobody says it. Schools where people stay silent because speaking up risks disapproval. Relationships where someone accepts treatment they know is wrong because the role assigned to them feels stronger than their own voice. It is about every place where "is this right" gets replaced by "is this what I am supposed to do?" But here is the part history forgets. 35% refused. More than 1 in 3 participants in the shock experiment stopped. They said no. Not always loudly. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes simply by refusing to press the next switch. But they stopped. And researchers later studied what separated them from the obedient majority. It was not intelligence. Not religion. Not bravery. Not personality. The most consistent difference was simple. They paused. Before the next switch. Before the next step. Before momentum carried them forward. They created a moment of stillness. And inside that pause, they asked, "Is this right?" Not, "Will I get in trouble?" Not, "What is everyone else doing?" Not, "What does authority want?" Just, "Is this right?" That pause changed everything. It was the difference between compliance and conscience, between momentum and moral judgment. And when someone else refused first, the effect multiplied. Because courage is contagious. The agentic state depends on the illusion that everyone agrees. Everyone is continuing. This is normal. This is expected. The moment someone calmly refuses, the illusion cracks. People remember they have a choice. That is why the obedience rate collapsed to 10% when others stopped first. Not because people became heroes. Because they remembered they were allowed to think. Think about your own life. Your job. Your family. Your friendships. Your silence. There have been moments. Moments when something inside you whispered this is not right. But you continued. Because it was easier. Because everyone else did. Because speaking would change the room. Because stopping would cost something. That does not make you evil. It makes you human. The pattern is not proof of moral failure. It is proof of structure. But awareness changes structure. People who understand the agentic state are less likely to enter it unconsciously. People who train themselves to pause are harder to control. People who practice asking, "Is this right?" build an internal compass stronger than external pressure. You do not need to be fearless. You do not need to be the loudest person in the room. You do not need a dramatic, heroic moment. Sometimes resistance is quiet. A refusal, a question, a pause, a sentence spoken calmly. "I am not comfortable with this. I think we should stop. This does not feel right." That is enough. Because when one person says it, others remember they can too. You are not just making a private decision. You are changing the moral architecture of the room. You are making conscience visible. And that matters more than most people realize. The psychologist behind the original obedience study died young. He carried the ethical weight of his work heavily. He knew what he had asked people to experience. He knew many left believing, even temporarily, that they had harmed another person. He defended the research because he believed ignorance was worse. A world where people did not understand this pattern was more dangerous than a world disturbed by seeing it clearly. Near the end of his life, he said the purpose was never to make people feel ashamed. It was to help them choose differently. Choose differently. Two simple words. That is the heart of everything. The prison researcher spent decades trying to understand what happened in that basement. He eventually wrote that harmful behavior is often not the product of monstrous individuals. It is the product of ordinary people inside powerful situations. Systems, roles, authority, momentum, and the loss of the pause. That is the warning, but also the hope. Because if the problem were monsters, there would be little we could do. But if the problem is structure, awareness matters. Patterns can be interrupted. Roles can be questioned. Systems can be resisted. The pause can be recovered. That is why this story matters. Not as old psychology, not as history, as a mirror. A mirror for your life right now, for the job you are doing, the silence you are keeping, the role you are performing, the decision you have been postponing, the thing you know, the thing you keep trying not to know. The experiment did not prove humans are broken. It proved we are patterned, and patterns can be changed, rewritten, interrupted. The pattern lives in all of us, but so does the pause. And that pause, that tiny moment between instruction and action, between expectation and choice, between fear and honesty, may be the most powerful thing a human being possesses. Because inside that pause lives freedom. Inside that pause lives conscience. Inside that pause lives the person you actually are. Every story has a thread, and this one runs through laboratories, courtrooms, prisons, offices, dining tables, and the quiet corners of your own mind. It asks only one question. Is this right? Not tomorrow, not in theory, now, in your life, in the next decision, in the next silence, in the next moment when the system asks for your obedience. The pattern is always there, but so is the choice, and that choice belongs to you. This is the Pattern Weavers. New threads every week. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. And in the comments below, tell us this. Can you remember a moment in your own life when you were inside the agentic state? A moment when you continued, even though something inside you told you to pause. We would genuinely love to hear your story, because your story is part of the pattern too, and every thread reveals truth.